Okay, let's unpack this. The future of work. For a lot of us, it feels less like that inspiring sci-fi vision and more like a low-grade anxiety that's just getting steadily worse.
Hmm.
Will the robots and AI really take our jobs?
Hmm.
And it's not just about the paycheck, is it?
No, not at all.
It's that kind of knot-in-the-stomach feeling of potentially losing economic security, maybe even our sense of agency in the world.
Yeah.
And honestly, the sheer speed of all this technological change can just feel overwhelming.
That feeling you're describing, it's completely understandable. I mean, it's rooted in very real trends that the sources we looked at really lay bare.
Right.
But what if we didn't just see this as like an inevitable threat?
Okay.
What if we viewed it as a potential turning point? Maybe a profound opportunity to fundamentally rethink and, redesign how our economies actually work for people.
And that's really the core of this deep dive, isn't it? It's about facing that shift, like head on. It's about exploring the possibility that technology, particularly automation, doesn't have to lead to a future of mass unemployment and, stark inequality.
Right.
What if it could actually free us from traditional labor if, and this is the big if we are intentional about how we steer it?
Mm-hmm. That intentionality is key.
And crucially, we're going to look at how societies right now are actively experimenting with tangible ways to make sure that the wealth and well-being generated by this technological progress are broadly shared.
Yeah, getting beyond just GDP.
Exactly. It's about leaning into a future that's not some, dystopian cyberpunk nightmare, but something far more hopeful. Maybe something with a bit more of that solar punk sensibility you mentioned.
A solar punk sensibility, precisely. It's kind of an aspirational vision, right? Where the focus isn't just on efficiency or profit, but on shared prosperity.
Right.
Where technology actually empowers individuals and communities, and where human well-being is truly prioritized.
And the exciting part, as our sources show, is that this isn't just theory. People are actually, building the pieces of this future already.
They really are. It's happening now.
Right, and that's where this stack of material becomes so valuable. We've pulled together a collection of sources that give us both the big picture and the granular detail.
Yeah, there's a lot here.
Reports digging deep into automation's real-world impact. Research on these frontier technologies like blockchain and digital identity, historical analyses showing how past economic transformations unfolded, studies on alternative ownership models like co-ops and land trusts, and, fascinating discussions on how we might measure societal progress and well-being beyond just traditional employment stats.
These sources offer a really rich tapestry, I think. They show us the powerful forces at play, and crucially, they highlight the diverse and often surprising steps being taken right now around the world to build this more equitable future.
Yeah.
They demonstrate that people aren't just talking about the problem, they're actively, prototyping solutions.
So our mission in this deep dive is to extract the most important insights, the essential nuggets of knowledge from all this material. We want to truly understand the profound forces driving this change, yes. But even more importantly, we want to explore the concrete actions, the experiments, and the potential pathways already being forged.
Yeah.
To build a future where economic agency is broad-based, not concentrated, and where human well-being is genuinely at the forefront. Let's dive in.
Okay, let's do it. Let's start by grounding ourselves in the reality that the sources describe this shifting landscape of work and the profound impact automation is already having. What's the core challenge they really emphasize?
The core problem, and the sources are quite clear on this, is that automation, particularly the significant waves we've seen accelerating since the 1980s, isn't just tweaking the edges of the job market.
No.
It's fundamentally restructuring it.
Yeah.
It's altering not just what tasks are done, but how wealth is generated and, critically, how it's distributed among people.
And the data points in the material are quite compelling, showing this structural shift at a macro level.
Definitely.
Take, for example, the impact on wages and inequality, particularly in countries like the U.S.
You see some striking numbers here. One piece of research cited estimates that automation is responsible for a truly substantial portion, somewhere between, 50 and 70% of the changes we've observed in the entire U.S. wage structure over the last 4 decades.
50 to 70%.
Think about that. Over half of the shifts in what different people earn are directly tied back to automation.
It's a huge number, right? And it's not just affecting average wages, it's explicitly widening the gap between different income groups.
Yeah.
Further research referenced in the sources specifically attributes like 52% of the increase in wage inequality between groups in the U.S. from 1980 to 2016 directly to automation.
Wow.
And this coincides precisely with the period where real wages for workers without a college degree saw either stagnation or, actual decline.
So it's not just affecting those in the very bottom, it's really impacting what was traditionally the middle class.
Absolutely. And the sources make a strong data-backed argument that automation has played a more significant role in the overall U.S. earnings losses experienced over the last 40, 50 years than other frequently cited factors.
Like offshoring or deunionization.
Exactly. Factors that often capture more public attention. This really recenters the conversation on the profound economic power of technological change itself.
That's a critical point to understand that the technology story is perhaps the dominant factor in recent wage trends, maybe even more than job migration or the decline of unions.
It seems to be. And this impact is visible even at a sort of micro level. One study mentioned focusing on industrial robots specifically, found that for every additional industrial robot introduced per 1,000 workers in a local labor market, there was an associated 0.42% reduction in wages.
So a direct, measurable effect happening on the ground.
Yeah, it's not just abstract theory.
And this isn't just a phenomenon confined to the United States, correct?
Not at all. The sources are clear that these wage-suppressing and inequality-amplifying effects of automation are global trends.
Okay.
They are playing out across developed economies, demonstrating a widespread structural shift driven by the same underlying technological forces.
Beyond just the numbers on a paycheck, the types of jobs available and their inherent quality are also changing dramatically.
That's a crucial and often overlooked aspect. The sources discuss how automation doesn't just eliminate jobs, it alters the nature of the work that remains or is created. The new jobs often lack the same level of security, maybe opportunities for development or even intrinsic satisfaction as the jobs that were lost.
Right, leading to more precarious work.
Exactly. A rise in more precarious or less fulfilling work arrangements.
And this feeds directly into that idea of job polarization, sometimes called the hollowing out of the middle class.
Exactly. Automation disproportionately targets jobs that involve routine manual and routine cognitive tasks.
Yeah, the predictable stuff.
Right. We've seen this evolution from early automation impacting manufacturing assembly lines to later waves affecting administrative and clerical roles.
Okay.
Now, the sources indicate this hollowing out effect is increasingly reaching into sectors like retail, customer service, logistics, and even aspects of financial services. These were often the stable, middle-income occupations that provided a pathway to prosperity for many families. Their decline erodes the foundation of the middle class.
So where is job growth happening then, if those middle jobs are shrinking?
The pattern described is typically concentrated at the two ends of the skill and wage spectrum.
High and low.
Pretty much. Growth in high-skill, high-wage professional jobs and growth in low-skill, low-wage service jobs.
Right.
This means displaced middle-skill workers often find themselves pushed into those lower-paying service roles if they can find work at all.
And that's not always a guarantee either.
No. And some sources express concern that even the growth potential in some low-wage service areas might be slowing down in certain economies.
This feels like a fundamental shift in the balance of power between, labor and capital.
It is, and it's reflected in another key trend documented across the sources, the decline in labor share of national income.
Okay, explain that a bit more.
It's basically the portion of a country's total economic output, the GDP, that goes to workers in the form of wages, salaries, benefits, versus the portion that goes to capital owners in the form of profits, rents, interest, that kind of thing.
And that labor share is going down.
Since the 1980s, yeah. Labor share has fallen significantly in many countries and industries.
And the material connects this decline directly back to technology and automation.
Yes. Research indicates that technology is a major driver of this decline, accounting for roughly half of the observed global reduction in labor share.
Wow, half.
Yeah. The argument is pretty straightforward. As capital inputs like robots and software become cheaper and more capable, firms have a stronger economic incentive to substitute machines for human workers.
Makes sense from a business perspective.
Right. This decreased demand for labor relative to capital reduces labor's bargaining power and, consequently, its claim on the economic output.
which explains that widening gap between productivity and wages that we've heard so much about for years.
Precisely. For decades after World War II, productivity and median wages tended to rise together, more or less.
Yeah, people felt like they were getting ahead.
Exactly. But since the late 1970s, productivity has continued its upward trajectory while median wages have largely stagnated.
Plotline.
Pretty much. This decoupling is a stark indicator that the benefits of economic growth, generated by increased productivity, are no longer being broadly shared with workers in the same way they were in the mid-20th century.
And now the sources suggest the next wave of AI is poised to extend this disruption even further, beyond just those routine tasks.
This is what makes the current moment feel maybe different and potentially even more impactful.
How so?
Earlier automation often focused on repetitive, predictable tasks, right?
Right, like on an assembly line.
Exactly. Modern AI is increasingly capable of performing non-routine cognitive tasks and even roles previously thought to require uniquely human creativity, judgment, and complex problem solving.
Seriously? Like what?
We're talking about things like driving vehicles, translating languages, writing articles, coding software, diagnosing medical conditions, even generating art or music.
Whoa. Okay, so the potential risk is expanding from blue-collar and clerical roles into skilled white-collar and professional domains.
Exactly. While the precise numbers vary and are, subject to debate.
Sure.
Earlier estimates like the widely cited Frey and Osborne study from 2013 suggested up to 47% of U.S. jobs were at high risk of automation over the coming decades.
Nearly half.
Yeah. And more recent, larger-scale projections, like those from McKinsey, point to massive global job displacement potential, perhaps 400 to 800 million global jobs by 2030.
800 million?
Which could necessitate up to 375 million workers transitioning to entirely new occupational categories.
That's a scale of potential disruption that's hard to wrap your head around.
It really is. And from a business perspective, the economic logic driving this is clear and compelling. Automation offers reduced labor costs, increased output and quality, and often vastly enhanced scalability.
Right.
The sources give examples like WhatsApp running on highly automated infrastructure with a tiny number of employees relative to its huge user base.
Yeah, I remember those stories.
Or Instagram serving millions with just a handful of staff before its acquisition. This kind of exponential scalability built on digital automation changes the fundamental economics of many industries.
That user-to-employee ratio in those tech examples is just mind-boggling and illustrates the point perfectly.
It does. And we see massive automation uptake continuing in traditional sectors, too.
Like manufacturing.
Definitely. There are now over 4 million industrial robots installed globally, with robot density doubling worldwide in just 7 years. South Korea, the global leader, has over 1,000 robots per 10,000 workers.
1,000. Wow.
Yeah. Logistics is integrating autonomous trucks and remote supervision to reduce driver needs. Office and administrative functions are leveraging robotic process automation, RPA, and AI for routine processing in areas like finance and insurance.
Even farming.
Even agriculture is seeing autonomous tractors and harvesting equipment, and healthcare is automating specific diagnostic or surgical tasks. Although, crucially, the human element remains absolutely critical there for trust, empathy, and complex judgment.
Yeah, you wouldn't want a robot giving you bad news, probably.
Probably not.
It's clear this is an accelerating multi-sector trend. And the sources even discuss the theoretical idea of an optimal workforce, which, from a purely cost minimization perspective, seems to be trending towards zero in some processes.
Yeah, it's a stark concept. In certain manufacturing contexts, for example, while fully dark factories operating without any human presence are still rare, the economic pressure is relentless towards achieving maximum output with minimal direct human labor. The sources suggest that in an ideal, fully optimized system, the optimal direct production workforce could conceptually be zero.
Zero.
With maybe a small remote team overseeing and managing the automated systems. This is the powerful business case driving adoption, transforming variable labor costs into more predictable, lower, and highly scalable fixed and operational costs.
So if this shift towards potentially lower labor income is happening, How do we even measure this move towards a more post-labor economy? Is there a way to track it?
One interesting metric proposed in the sources is the Economic Agency Index, or EAI.
The EAI. Okay, what exactly does that metric capture?
It's essentially a composite index designed to provide a clearer picture of where people's income is actually coming from.
Oh, okay.
It aims to differentiate between income derived from traditional labor wages, salaries, that kind of thing.
Right.
Income derived from capital ownership, like dividends, interest, rent, appreciation of assets, and income received from public transfers, like Social Security, unemployment benefits, or potentially basic income payments.
So it's looking at the composition of income for individuals or households, not just the total amount they receive.
Exactly. The underlying idea is that as automation advances and potentially erodes traditional wage earning opportunities, and as capital ownership becomes a larger source of wealth generation, we would expect to see a shift in the EAI. A larger share of income would come from capital ownership or from public transfers, while a smaller share would come from wages.
Okay.
A higher overall share from capital income, under this definition, signals a more post-labor economy, where passive income from assets plays a more dominant role.
That makes sense. It provides a tangible way to quantify this abstract idea of a shift away from a labor-centric economy.
And these kinds of metrics are crucial, right? Because they make the problem visible and trackable. They move the discussion from abstract fears about robots taking jobs to concrete data points that policymakers, economists, communities can use to understand the structural changes happening.
And hopefully do something about it.
And hopefully spur action, exactly. If a city or region sees its EAI consistently shifting away from labor income, it's a clear signal that proactive strategies are needed to ensure its residents maintain economic security.
Okay, so the sources lay out the challenge. Automation is eroding traditional wage income for many and increasing inequality by shifting wealth towards capital owners.
Yeah, that's the core problem.
The fundamental question for building that more hopeful future becomes, if wage income is becoming less central, how can societies ensure everyone still shares in prosperity and has economic agency?
Right.
And this is where the building blocks come in: rethinking wealth, rethinking ownership.
Precisely. And the sources delve into a fascinating array of interventions and models that are already being tested and implemented around the world to build these alternative pathways to economic security and shared prosperity.
Okay, let's start with different models of economic redistribution. Universal Basic Income, or UBI, and Universal Basic Dividend, UBD, seem to be prominent concepts here.
Yes, UBI is probably the most widely discussed concept in this space. The fundamental idea, as the sources describe it, is basically a regular cash payment provided to individuals, ideally unconditionally, as a baseline safety net.
Safety net, okay.
And the goals range from ensuring no one falls below a basic living standard to providing economic security in a changing job market, stimulating the economy, and even improving public health and well-being.
And the material highlights some real-world trials of UBI with some interesting results.
They do. For instance, the Ontario Basic Income pilot in Canada, although it was unfortunately cut short.
Right, I remember that.
It showed significant self-reported improvements among participants. They reported reduced stress and anxiety, lower rates of depression, and improvements in tangible areas like housing security and nutrition. It also enabled some participants to pursue education or training, positioning them for better job opportunities later and spend more time with family and friends.
So perhaps less of the work disincentive that critics often raise. People weren't just quitting their jobs.
Both the Ontario trial and earlier, larger-scale experiments like the Mincome trial in Manitoba back in the 1970s found minimal overall negative impact on work hours.
Really?
Yeah, with some specific exceptions like maybe young mothers or students who arguably were investing in future human capital anyway.
Good point.
Notably, Mincome, which covered an entire town, saw a significant 8.5% decline in hospitalizations.
8.5%. That's huge.
It is, and it was strongly linked to the reduction in stress and poverty-related health issues enabled by the basic income.
That health outcome is truly remarkable and speaks to the potential broader societal benefits beyond just income.
It does. It suggests that poverty and insecurity have significant health costs, and providing basic income can actually be a preventative measure.
What about the Universal Basic Dividend, the UBD? How's that different?
It's related but often proposes funding the payments differently. specifically by levying fees or taxes on common goods,
Common goods,
like environmental pollution or the use of collective data. The Earth for All initiative, for example, proposes a UBD funded by fees on extracting common resources. It's about recognizing that certain forms of wealth are generated collectively or from shared resources and should therefore benefit everyone.
But funding UBI at a scale that's meaningful across an entire nation seems like an enormous hurdle. That's always the big question, right?
It's arguably the biggest practical challenge discussed in the sources. Implementing a meaningful UBI in a large country like the U.S. could cost trillions annually.
Trillions.
Potentially double current federal transfer spending. This would require entirely new, very large-scale revenue streams or a drastic reallocation of existing budgets.
And there are valid criticisms about whether a flat UBI payment can adequately replace complex, targeted social services designed for specific needs, like disability support or specialized healthcare.
Exactly. Critics worry it could be regressive if it leads to cuts in other vital social programs.
Yeah.
The sources imply that in a post-labor future, UBI would likely function as a floor, a bus line, but would still need to be complemented by targeted social services and potentially other forms of support by, say, 2060.
Right.
It's unlikely a single payment could meet all diverse needs. Political acceptance for the level of taxation potentially required, perhaps high taxes on automation, carbon emissions, financial transactions, is also highly uncertain.
So UBI is a necessary tool, perhaps, but maybe not sufficient on its own to build this equitable future.
That seems to be a key takeaway. While UBI ensures a baseline, the sources suggest that without other fundamental changes like wealth redistribution, labor reforms, robust public services, and fostering inclusive ownership models, the gains from UBI alone could be absorbed by rising costs. And it doesn't necessarily grant people a genuine stake or voice in the economy. It needs to be part of a much broader systemic framework.
Okay. Speaking of wealth redistribution and granting a stake, social wealth funds are another model that keeps coming up in these discussions.
Social wealth funds are essentially public investment funds that accumulate assets, stocks, bonds, real estate, infrastructure on behalf of all citizens.
On behalf of everyone.
Yes. And then distribute the investment returns as a dividend. The idea is to create a collective endowment for the population.
Interesting.
While the U.S. doesn't have a federal one currently, proposals exist, like the American Solidarity Fund, which envisions the government acquiring productive assets to generate universal dividends.
Like the famous example of Norway's oil fund. Is that similar?
Norway's government pension fund Global is the prime example and a major inspiration, yes. It's amassed enormous public assets, managing Norway's oil and gas revenues and investing them globally.
How big is it?
Its value now equals about 271% of Norway's annual GDP.
Wow.
The investment returns alone can be staggering. In a good year like 2017, these returns theoretically amounted to over $25,000 per Norwegian citizen.
25 grand per person.
Yeah.
Just from the fund.
Just from the returns in that year, yeah.
Yeah.
While achieving that scale is obviously a long-term ambition, the sources note that a well-funded U.S. federal fund could potentially pay out several $1,000s per adult per year just from investment earnings.
And these aren't just abstract ideas. Public investment funds already exist in many places, don't they?
That's right. Dozens of countries and U.S. states already operate various forms of public funds, from sovereign wealth funds based on natural resources to state pension funds or future funds.
Like Alaska.
Exactly. The Alaska Permanent Fund, which pays an annual dividend to residents from oil revenues, is a well-known U.S. example.
Are there state-level examples using these funds for purposes beyond just, like, revenue generation?
Yes, the sources mention examples like the Western Australia Future Fund. They repurposed iron ore royalties to establish a fund whose investment earnings, around $50 million a year now, are dedicated to funding health research and innovation across the state.
That's close.
Or the NSW Generations Fund in Australia, which, while primarily focused on debt retirement, also supports local projects. These show how collectively held assets can generate ongoing streams of funding for public benefit.
Land value tax, LVT, and using that revenue for land dividends is another fascinating concept that ties taxation to value generated by the community itself. Can you unpack that?
Sure. The idea here is rooted in economics stretching back centuries. Land value, basically, the value of a location itself, separate from any buildings or improvements on it, is often created not by the individual landowner, but by public investments like roads, parks, infrastructure, population growth, and overall community development.
Like the location thing.
Exactly. Taxing this unimproved land value is seen by many economists as highly efficient and fair because it doesn't penalize productive activity like building or working, and it's difficult to evade.
And using that revenue for a dividend, how does that work?
Using the revenue from an LVT to fund a universal dividend aligns with the principle that the value generated by the commons, in this case, location value created by the community, should benefit everyone in that community.
Makes sense.
Analysis cited suggests that implementing a full land value tax could potentially generate enough revenue to fund a very substantial basic income for the population.
So moving from taxing income from work to taxing location value created by everyone.
Essentially, yeah. It's a shift in the tax base that reflects a different understanding of where wealth comes from. And tied into the idea of providing capital directly, there are these capital endowment programs, often called baby bonds.
Ah, yes, baby bonds. This is the idea of giving direct asset grants to individuals, typically young people, to provide them with a capital stake right from the start.
Yes. The concept is to establish trust funds for children, often with initial deposits that are larger for children from lower-income families, that they can access later in life, maybe at age 18 or 21, for specific purposes like education, buying a home, or starting a business.
This seems like an idea that would resonate with a lot of people, giving kids a fair shot.
The sources mention that polling indicates strong public support for the idea of giving children a better start, especially when framed as an investment in the next generation and a tool to reduce wealth inequality, particularly the racial wealth gap that stems from historical disadvantages in asset accumulation. Testimony from programs like one being explored in Connecticut highlights how asset poverty can be a powerful trap for families and how an endowment could be a truly game-changing boost for a low-income child's future economic security.
And there are existing examples of this kind of direct asset transfer already.
California, for instance, has established HOPE accounts for foster youth, providing them with a financial cushion when they age out of the system at 18.
That's great.
And historically, though, facing their own complex challenges, land redistribution programs, like land grants in South Africa or Zimbabwe, were viewed by recipients not just as an economic transfer, but as an act of justice and something that fostered a sense of pride and agency and ownership, despite, the subsequent difficulties in making those farms productive in some cases.
So these diverse approaches, UBI, UBD, social wealth funds, LVT dividends, capital endowments, are all distinct ways to redistribute or provide capital income directly, potentially reducing reliance on traditional wages as the sole source of security.
They represent tangible steps towards decoupling well-being from just labor income and ensuring that everyone has a stake in the prosperity generated by technology and the economy as a whole.
But the sources also look beyond just redistributing wealth to changing who owns the means of generating that wealth in the first place. Alternative ownership models seem critical here.
Absolutely. If automation and capital accumulation are shifting wealth and power towards capital owners, one powerful approach is to broaden who those capital owners are.
Make more people owners.
Exactly. This involves creating and scaling models where ownership is shared, collective, or community-based.
Community land trusts, or CLTs, are a well-known example, particularly in the housing sector. How do they work?
CLTs are typically nonprofit organizations that acquire land and hold it in trust for the long-term benefit of a specific community.
Holding the land in trust, okay.
They might build affordable housing or support local businesses on this land, but they use a legal mechanism, usually a ground lease, to permanently separate the ownership of the land itself from the ownership of the buildings or homes on that land.
And separating land and building ownership helps maintain affordability over time. How?
Precisely. The CLT owns the land in perpetuity. This means that even as the value of the land in a desirable area might skyrocket due to market speculation, that appreciation isn't transferred to the individual building owner in the same way it would be in conventional homeownership. When a CLT homeowner sells their home, they sell it at a capped affordable price to the next eligible low to moderate income buyer.
So the unit stays affordable forever, basically.
That's the goal, ensuring the unit remains permanently affordable for the community.
They seem particularly relevant now with housing costs going crazy in so many places.
Yes, CLTs are seeing a resurgence as cities grapple with housing affordability crises and inequality. They offer a way to create and preserve affordable housing stock outside of the speculative market.
Are there examples?
The sources mention examples like the pioneering Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative in Boston or recent efforts by New York City to support the growth of CLTs in boroughs like the Bronx and Queens to protect affordable housing. London has also used CLTs to create homes whose prices are linked to local incomes, enabling people like teachers and nurses to afford to live in the city they serve.
So the homeowner gains stability and pride in their home, while the community gains permanent affordability. It's a win-win.
That's the core benefit. As one CLT homeowner in Portland is quoted in the sources, they felt they were given the gift of stability and pride through managing predictable costs and participating in building community wealth rather than just private wealth.
Housing cooperatives are another model where residents share ownership, structured a bit differently, right?
Right. In a housing cooperative, the residents collectively own the entire property, the building, the land, the common spaces, through a cooperative corporation.
So you don't own your specific apartment.
Individuals don't directly own their unit in the traditional sense. Instead, they own a share in the cooperative that grants them the right to occupy a specific unit and participate in the governance of the property.
And limited equity cooperatives specifically tackle affordability. How's that work?
Yes, limited equity co-ops, or LECs, are designed with affordability as a primary goal. Residents buy a share in the co-op, often for a significantly lower upfront cost than buying a comparable condo or house. The key feature is that the resale value of that share is capped. This prevents residents from extracting large speculative profits when they move out.
Got it.
Instead, they sell their share back to the co-op at the capped price, which is often the original purchase price, plus maybe a small appreciation factor, ensuring the unit remains affordable for the next low-income buyer.
So the residents are effectively their own landlord, making decisions about maintenance and finances without the profit motive of traditional landlords.
Exactly. Decisions are made democratically by the residents, and financial management focuses on covering costs and maintaining the property, not generating profits for external owners. The sources describe a spectrum of these models, from small, single-building co-ops to potentially citywide systems. They note that success often relies on supportive public policy and a community culture that truly values long-term affordability and collective stability over private speculative gain.
Right.
The essence is that we are both tenants and owners, sharing both the responsibilities and the benefits.
That fundamental shift in relationship to housing feels very aligned with a more equitable future vision. And this concept of worker ownership extends to businesses with worker cooperatives.
Worker cooperatives are businesses where the workers collectively own and control the company. They share in the profits and participate in decision-making processes, often on a democratic basis, like one worker, one vote.
Cool.
Any examples?
The sources offer compelling examples from Argentina after the 2001 economic crisis. Workers took over factories abandoned by their owners, famous ones like the textile plant Bruckmann or the ceramics factory Zenon, and successfully ran them as worker co-ops, preserving jobs and livelihoods.
Wow, taking over the factory.
Yeah. This model also exists in the urban informal sector, like groups of waste pickers organizing into cooperatives.
And these alternative ownership models aren't confined to wealthy nations. The sources show they're thriving globally, right?
Absolutely. The cooperative movement is massive in places like Kenya, for instance. Over 14 million members, contributing about 10% of the national GDP.
10% from co-ops. Yeah. This includes diverse examples like Sakos savings and credit co-ops, where members pool savings, provide loans, and receive interest dividends, dairy farmer co-ops that collectively market milk and share bonuses, and even groups of Uber drivers forming co-ops to collectively rent or purchase cars.
Interesting.
Ethiopia has strong agricultural co-ops that allow farmers to pool resources and share profits from coffee exports. Latin America has a rich history of solidarity economy initiatives, from Uruguay's FUCV housing cooperative movement, which has built tens of thousands of homes, to large agricultural co-ops in Brazil. Even at the micro level in places like Uganda or Bangladesh, women's groups or village collectives are pooling their limited capital to co-own small businesses like solar kiosk franchises and share the returns.
So these different models, land trusts, housing co-ops, worker co-ops, diverse global co-ops, are all tangible existing pathways to broaden who benefits from assets in economic activity. They're about building economic security and agency at the community and individual level, independent of relying solely on a traditional wage.
They fundamentally shift power and wealth distribution by making more people owners rather than just employees or tenants.
Okay, shifting gears slightly. The sources also explore how digital technology itself, The same technology driving automation can potentially be harnessed to build new forms of economic agency and civic participation.
Right.
The idea of a new civic contract is mentioned, potentially encoded in our digital infrastructure. What's that about?
Yes, it's a powerful idea presented in the sources that technologies like blockchain and cryptography aren't just financial tools. They can be seen as tools of collective action encoded in our very infrastructure.
Tools of collective action.
Yeah. They suggest these digital tools could potentially enable new forms of self-organization and coordination that complement or even partially replace traditional labor or political structures in facilitating collective action and value creation.
Decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, seem like a prime example of this digitally native collective action. Can you explain DAOs simply?
Okay. DAOs can be conceptualized as digitally native versions of co-ops, clubs, or even startups.
Okay.
They are governed not by a traditional hierarchical structure or a board of directors, but by code, specifically smart contracts deployed on a blockchain.
Governed by code.
Yeah. Decisions about the organization's operation, treasury management, or future development are made by token holders who vote on proposals, and the outcomes of those votes can be automatically executed by the code.
We often hear about the early sort of tumultuous experiments with DAOs, like the infamous DAO hack back in 2016. Have they matured?
Those early days were indeed chaotic and involved significant learning experiences, often the hard way.
Yeah.
But the sources indicate that by 2025, DAOs have matured considerably. They've moved beyond being purely speculative experiments to governing significant amounts of real value, managing large treasuries, and running complex protocols like stablecoins, decentralized exchanges, or funding public goods.
So they're becoming real organizations.
They are evolving into organizations with real economic substance and purpose, yes.
Gitcoin is highlighted as a compelling case study of a DAO in action. What do they do?
Gitcoin is a platform and community that uses a unique funding mechanism called quadratic funding.
Quadratic funding.
Yeah, implemented via smart contracts to support public goods and open source software development in the blockchain space, instead of funding projects based purely on the total dollar amount donated.
Right.
Quadratic funding allocates matching funds based on the number of unique contributors.
Ah, okay. So more contributors means more matching funds, even if they donate less.
Exactly. It gives smaller donors more weight and encourages broad community support, creating a more democratic and decentralized model for funding shared resources, kind of a digital funding system for the commons, managed by the community itself through the DAO.
The decentralized and consensus-driven nature seems key, but also potentially raises questions about power dynamics, right? Like who really controls it?
It does. The design goal is for DAOs to be consensus-driven, where significant changes require broad agreement from token holders. This distributed decision-making gives them a degree of legitimacy, as no single individual or small group can unilaterally force changes.
Yeah.
But just like in traditional organizations, power can still concentrate in DAOs, often with the largest token holders who possess more voting weight. This raises questions about genuine democratic control versus, plutocratic tendencies where the richest token holders call the shots.
And the legal system is still trying to figure out how these novel digital entities fit into existing legal framework.
Absolutely. DAOs don't fit neatly into traditional categories like corporations or partnerships.
Right.
Some jurisdictions are attempting to create new legal structures to accommodate them, such as Wyoming's laws allowing DAOs to register as special types of LLCs or nonprofit associations, DOAAs. These laws aim to grant DAOs legal personhood, provide limited liability for participants, and legally recognize their on-chain governance rules. This provides much-needed legal clarity for DAOs operating within that jurisdiction.
But regulators are also asserting their authority, viewing DAOs through existing legal lenses, aren't they?
Yes. Regulators like the U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, have taken enforcement actions against DAOs, essentially treating token holders as responsible parties under existing regulations if the DAO engages in activities that violate those laws.
So it's an ongoing tension.
It shows the edge that DAOs are pushing against traditional legal boundaries and the ongoing effort by the legal system to either adapt or apply existing rules.
Moving from decentralized organizations to individual digital identity, verifiable digital identity or self-sovereign identity, SSI, seems crucial for empowering individuals in the digital realm. What's the core idea?
SSI is a big paradigm shift in how we manage digital identity. Instead of relying on central authorities like companies or governments to issue and hold all our identity data and credentials,
like they do now, mostly.
Right. SSI focuses on individuals holding their own cryptographic credentials that prove attributes about them.
Credentials like?
Like a university diploma, a professional license, proof of age, things like that. These credentials can be verified cryptographically by others without requiring the issuer or a third party to be involved in every single transaction. This often relies on decentralized identifiers, DIDs, anchored on distributed networks, though not always a public blockchain.
So the individual becomes the owner and controller of their own digital identity information. You hold your own digital passport, essentially.
Precisely. You possess the proof of your attributes and you decide who you share it with and when. The European Blockchain Services Infrastructure, EBSI, is an example of a public sector initiative building a cross-border framework for issuing and verifying digital credentials using blockchain technology. The Sovereign Network, built on Hyperledger Indy, is another example of a decentralized identity network enabling individuals to build and carry a portable digital reputation, proof of skills, work history, etc., that isn't locked into a single platform like LinkedIn or Facebook.
What are the key benefits that the sources highlight for this approach? Why is it better?
A major benefit is enhanced privacy. By storing credentials with the individual and verifying them peer-to-peer, you avoid the creation of large centralized databases, data honeypots, that are vulnerable to hacks or mass surveillance.
Right, that's a big problem.
It truly empowers individuals by giving them control over their identity data. Trust becomes mediated by cryptography. You trust that the credential hasn't been tampered with because of the cryptographic signature, rather than solely trusting a central authority.
Okay.
The system ensures the authenticity of the credential while allowing the individual to share only the minimum necessary information privately.
This seems particularly impactful for marginalized populations, maybe.
It has significant potential there. For instance, it could help refugees or homeless individuals retain and verify crucial credentials like birth certificates, medical records, educational qualifications, without needing physical documents that are easily lost or stolen.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It creates a portable trust mechanism that isn't dependent on potentially inaccessible or prejudiced issuers or institutions.
But managing cryptographic keys sounds technically challenging for many people. Isn't that a barrier?
That's a real and significant challenge acknowledged in the sources. Not everyone has the technical literacy or resources to securely manage their own private cryptographic keys.
Right.
This raises questions about user experience, digital literacy programs, and the need for trusted third parties or guardianships for some individuals, which could potentially create new points of centralization again.
Bit of a catch-22.
Yeah. While trust in traditional authorities might be reduced, trust shifts to the network maintainers and governance bodies of the SSI system itself. Their accountability and open governance model, like sovereigns, are paramount to ensuring the system's integrity and preventing collusion or censorship.
Okay. Shifting from identity to data itself, the concept of data unions and data dignity seems to be gaining traction as a way to push back against surveillance capitalism. What's that about?
This is a direct response to the current model where large technology companies collect vast amounts of personal data, often without meaningful consent or compensation to the individual.
Yeah, our data is their product.
Exactly. And they use it to build incredibly profitable businesses. Data unions propose that individuals can pool their data perhaps anonymously or pseudonymously and collectively bargain for its sale, use, or licensing terms.
Like a labor union, but for data.
Exactly like that. Much like labor unions collectively bargain for wages and working conditions for their members.
So it's about people regaining property rights and control over the value their data generates, giving us data dignity.
Exactly. The core goal is to flip the script on surveillance capitalism, establish data dignity as a norm, and ensure that individuals actually benefit from the value generated by their own information.
Are there platforms doing this?
Frameworks and protocols like Streamer and Ocean Protocol are being developed to facilitate this. There are nascent examples like Swash, a browser extension where users can anonymously share their browsing data for payment, or Demo, where car owners can share their vehicle's sensor data for tokens that could potentially be used for services or shared value.
This could fundamentally restructure how the digital economy works, couldn't it?
It has that potential. By giving people collective control and an equity stake in their data, it could reshape the feedback loops of the digital economy.
Especially with AI needing so much data.
Exactly. It's particularly relevant to AI, which is ravenous for data. Data unions could give communities a voice and bargaining power regarding how their data is used for AI training and development, and potentially demand a share of the value created by that AI.
So you might see data cooperatives emerge.
You might. It's about finding a balance, leveraging the utility of pooled data while using encryption and collective governance to protect privacy.
Now, WorldCoin is mentioned as a particularly provocative, maybe even controversial, experiment operating in this space, combining digital identity verification with a potential economic stake. What's the deal with WorldCoin?
WorldCoin is a large-scale project proposing a global, transnational system. Its core mechanism involves verifying that someone is a unique human being by scanning their iris using a custom hardware device called the orb.
Scanning eyeballs.
Yeah.
Seriously.
Yeah, scanning irises. Once verified, the individual is given a world ID, a digital identity, and potentially receives a grant of WorldCoin crypto tokens. The system is managed by a private foundation and associated companies relying on algorithms and devices.
It seems to come with ambitious, almost utopian promises.
Yeah.
Like what?
The potential promises articulated are significant. Democratizing access to the digital economy globally, providing a mechanism to distribute a potential share of wealth generated by AI, like a global UBI distributed via tokens.
Oh.
Establishing a form of verifiable global citizenship in economic terms, and improving online transparency by providing a reliable proof of personhood to combat bots.
But the sources also highlight significant dystopian risks and controversies surrounding it. What are the big concerns?
Absolutely. The core concern raised by privacy advocates is the collection of biometric data scanning people's irises, which is deeply personal and immutable.
Yeah, you can't change your iris skin.
Right. Critics call it a dystopian trade, worrying about potential exploitation, particularly targeting lower-income communities in developing nations with the allure of free crypto tokens in exchange for sensitive biometric information. There are significant questions about the centralization of power in the private foundation controlling the technology and the tokens, potentially making it less accountable than a government-run system.
Right, who watches the watchers.
Exactly. Users have to place immense trust in the operators to secure their data and manage the system ethically. There are risks of losing access to this potentially essential credential or being subject to surveillance without effective recourse if the system malfunctions or acts maliciously.
And transparency issues.
Transparency about how the raw biometric images are handled, even if the final world ID is derived differently, remains a significant point of contention.
It starkly highlights the power dynamics and trust issues inherent in designing these large-scale digital systems, particularly when they intersect with identity and potential economic distribution.
Definitely.
Another digital layer mentioned is central bank digital currencies, or CBDCs. How do they fit in?
CBDCs are basically digital forms of a country's official fiat currency, issued and controlled by the central bank.
So digital dollars, digital euros.
Exactly. While they often use distributed ledger technology, DLT, they are distinct from decentralized cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum because the central bank maintains control over the supply and the rules.
Are many countries looking into this?
Yeah, over 130 countries are currently exploring or developing CBDCs.
Why? What are the primary motivations for central banks to pursue CBDCs?
Motivations vary, but often include improving the efficiency, safety, and resilience of payment systems, promoting financial inclusion for unbanked or underbanked populations, and, crucially, allowing central banks to maintain control over monetary sovereignty and the digital payments landscape as private cryptocurrencies and stablecoins emerge.
So it's about modernizing state monetary power rather than replacing it with something decentralized, keeping control.
Exactly. A CBDC, like the digital euro or the digital pound being researched by the European Central Bank and the Bank of England, would typically operate on a controlled, permissioned ledger managed by the central bank and authorized financial institutions. This structure allows for features like auditability and potentially even programmability, meaning money could theoretically be issued with conditions or automated compliance checks, but keeps the central bank firmly in charge of issuance and setting the rules, unlike decentralized systems.
China's digital yuan, the ECNY, seems to be one of the most advanced and raises particular privacy concerns, doesn't it?
China's ECNY is explicitly designed with what they call controllable anonymity.
Controllable anonymity? That sounds ominous.
Yeah. While smaller transactions might be relatively private, Larger or suspicious transactions are traceable by the authorities. Chinese officials have stated it can help combat illicit activities and implement targeted economic policies, such as issuing funds that expire if not spent by a certain date.
Wow, expiring money.
Yeah. Western security analysts express concerns about the potential for mass surveillance and its use to potentially bypass international sanctions.
In contrast, the Bahamas sand dollar seems to have focused more on financial inclusion.
The sand dollar was one of the earliest national CBDCs to launch. It was introduced with a strong emphasis on financial inclusion, aiming to provide digital payment access to residents across scattered islands.
Right. Makes sense there.
Particularly important for delivering aid quickly after hurricanes. While it has the legal status of cash and a solid foundation, its usage has remained relatively modest.
Why is that?
It illustrates that launching a CBDC is one thing, but driving widespread public adoption requires significant public education, building trust, and ensuring merchant acceptance. It's not just about the tech.
It really underscores how the design choices within these digital systems determine whether they primarily serve to empower individuals, centralize state control, or empower private entities.
Yes, the underlying architecture and governance model are paramount. The sources suggest that for certain civic applications, a hybrid approach might emerge.
Hybrid.
Using permissioned ledgers for day-to-day efficiency, while periodically anchoring data points or summaries onto a public blockchain for auditability and public accountability, trying to balance efficiency, privacy, and transparency.
Okay, so we've explored the landscape of automation's impact and the diverse analog and digital building blocks being developed to rethink wealth and ownership. Now, if automation handles more and more routine tasks, what is left for humans to do?
Yeah.
What does the future human role look like in this potentially more equitable solar punk-leaning future?
It's a huge question. The sources suggest that even as automation becomes incredibly sophisticated, there are fundamental human needs, desires, and capabilities that technology, at least in its current form, cannot fully replicate or replace.
Okay.
The human roles that are likely to endure and even grow are those that require genuine human connection, empathy, creativity, complex moral judgment, and nuanced social interaction.
The human stuff.
Pretty much. They cluster in what one source describes as an economy of meaning and emotion.
Economy of meaning and emotion. I like that. What specific types of roles fall into that category?
They point to roles in care and companionship, I think. Nurses, therapists, social workers, elder caregivers, child development specialists.
Right.
While robots might assist with lifting or logistics, the core value in these roles is the human element. Emotional support, understanding, building trust, providing comfort, and responding with genuine empathy.
And we're already seeing high demand projections for many of these roles, aren't we?
We are. U.S. labor statistics, for instance, project strong growth for home health and personal care aides and for substance abuse and mental health counselors.
Okay.
The sources also cite polls and studies showing a strong patient preference for human doctors, even if AI assists with diagnosis.
Yeah, I can see that.
And significant public discomfort with the idea of AI-only medical care or robot caregivers. The top concern articulated is losing that human touch and compassion. Even in countries like Japan, with pressing needs for elder care, some highly anticipated care robots have failed to achieve widespread adoption because they simply couldn't meet the complex emotional and social needs of care recipients.
So the deep human need for connection and empathy and care seems quite resistant to full automation, at least for the foreseeable future.
It appears so. Other areas include creative and cultural roles, writers, artists, musicians, filmmakers, designers.
Even with AI generating art and music now.
Yeah, even with that. While AI can generate vast amounts of content, human creators differentiate themselves by infusing their work with unique style, personal experience, emotional depth, and the ability to explore complex human themes in ways that resonate deeply with audiences.
Ah, the human spark.
Exactly. It's a move towards creativity that emphasizes authentic human expression. Audience demand for live human performances remains strong, and there's been public pushback against using technologies like deepfakes to replace actors. Live, in-person cultural experiences retain a unique value.
Roles focused on providing unique in-person experiences are also mentioned. Like
Well, what might be called experience providers roles like expert tour guides who can provide personalized context and human interaction, event planners who curate memorable shared moments, or hospitality hosts who create welcoming human environments.
Okay.
The value isn't just in the logistical execution, but in the human connection and curation of the experience itself.
And then there are roles requiring complex human judgment, leadership, and moral reasoning. things AI struggles with.
Definitely. Leadership and advocacy politicians, community organizers, activists, diplomats, mediators. These roles fundamentally rely on human capacities like persuasion, building trust, navigating complex social dynamics, exercising moral judgment, and engaging in nuanced negotiation.
No.
These are areas AI is currently ill-equipped to handle.
Right.
Education and personal development teachers, mentors, coaches. The role of educators is shifting from simply delivering information, which AI can do, to being guides, facilitators, and mentors, helping students develop critical thinking, creativity, and social-emotional skills, adapting their approach to individual human needs.
More like a coach than a lecturer.
Exactly.
And finally, roles where human lives and safety are directly at stake seem likely to retain a significant human element.
Emergency response and roles requiring human-in-the-loop oversight in safety-critical systems.
Like police or military.
Yeah. While drones or robots might assist police, firefighters, or military personnel with situational awareness or dangerous tasks, the public will almost certainly demand that a human remains ultimately in charge of morally weighted decisions.
Right.
Particularly those involving the use of force or putting lives at risk. There's a strong societal demand for human accountability in these critical situations.
It's interesting to consider how human preferences might evolve over time, though. Maybe we'll get used to AI customer service.
It is. The sources acknowledge this nuance. While people might currently prefer talking to a human customer service representative, for example, if an AI system becomes dramatically more efficient, accurate, and perhaps even capable of mimicking empathy convincingly, that preference might shift over time.
Like ATMs versus bank tellers.
Exactly. Much like how people largely transition from bank tellers to ATMs for routine cash withdrawals, human involvement in certain sectors could potentially shift towards only handling the most complicated, sensitive, or exceptional cases as AI handles the routine ones effectively.
But those core human roles remain.
However, the deeply human roles that rely on authentic connection, moral judgment, and creativity seem likely to retain their unique value.
And what about the time potentially freed up if traditional wage labor declines significantly? How do we spend that time? The sources look to historical examples of how societies have structured and perceived leisure, right?
Yes, they suggest that a post-labor future isn't just about providing income, it's about societies finding ways to support and encourage people in cultivating meaningful ways to use their time.
Not just sitting around.
No. Throughout history, elites or certain classes often had significant time free from manual labor, and their societies developed norms of expectations around how that leisure time should be spent.
Like the Roman concept of odium. What was that?
Otium was the Roman concept of time off from practical affairs, or negotium. It wasn't meant to be simple idleness, though.
Huh.
It was time dedicated to activities that cultivated dignity, standing, and humanitas culture, humanity, intellectual pursuits.
So self-improvement, basically.
Sort of. Abstaining from manual labor was a mark of status, but it came with expectations of engaging in activities like reading, writing, philosophical discussion, gardening, or contributing to public life. This contrasts with outright debauchery or the extreme asceticism of some philosophies.
Or the example of the Edo samurai in Japan. They weren't fighting all the time then.
During the long period of peace under the Edo shogunate, the samurai class, traditionally warriors, found themselves with time free from constant military conflict.
So what do they do?
They sought purpose not just in loyalty and martial training, but increasingly in perfecting their character through lifelong learning, cultural pursuits, and administration. The example of Hosokawa Shijo, a prominent figure who embodied the ideal by excelling as a warrior, administrator, artist, scholar, and even adopting elements of monastic practice, shows how purpose was sought beyond the battlefield. Their strict ethical code generally discouraged frivolousness, although exceptions existed among some disaffected samurai.
And the Islamic majlis or salons, what were those?
These were convivial social gatherings, often held in private homes, that were central to intellectual and cultural life in many parts of the Islamic world.
Okay.
They focused on conversation, poetry recitation, which was almost universally practiced music, and the discussion of literature, philosophy, and science. The art of conversation and appreciation of culture were central.
That's nice.
Yeah. While some elite gatherings could involve activities like drinking wine that were frowned upon religiously but socially common, the majlis highlight how structured leisure time was dedicated to intellectual exchange, aesthetic appreciation, and social connection. Even caliphs like Harun al-Rashid of the Abbasid Caliphate were known to participate in these discussions.
So the implication from these historical examples is profound. Simply providing income isn't enough for well-being in a future where traditional work is less central.
Exactly.
Societies will need to actively cultivate and support ways for people to find purpose, connection, learning, and creativity in their time, moving beyond simply filling hours to enabling a flourishing otium, maybe.
A flourishing odium, yeah, that's a good way to put it.
This all points to a potential future that is radically different from the present labor-centric economy. Shifting to a system with shared prosperity, redefined human roles, and meaningful leisure in the age of automation is, well, it's a monumental challenge. But the sources offer a powerful reminder. Implementing grand economic and social change isn't unprecedented in human history.
Yeah.
We've done big things before.
That historical perspective is incredibly valuable, I think. Societies have undergone transformations of this magnitude before, whether it was the massive disruptions of the Industrial Revolutions,
Right.
the fundamental restructuring during and after the Great Depression, the creation of the post-WWII economic order, or even the significant policy shifts of the neoliberal revolution in the 1980s.
Yeah.
These changes were never easy. They involved conflict and navigating diverse, often opposing interests, but they did happen.
And often these grand shifts were driven by a compelling sense of national mission or triggered by a crisis that galvanized political will and state capacity.
Exactly. Think about the United States during World War II. The war effort became an overarching national mission that completely reorganized the economy in just a matter of a few years.
Incredible speed.
Yeah. The government coordinated closely with private industry, dictating what to produce auto plants, shifting from cars to tanks, for example,
Right.
pouring resources into research and development, and spurring incredible technological and organizational innovation. This war-driven mobilization created a whole new economic foundation. Modern factories, advanced industries, a workforce skilled through wartime production, and later the GI Bill that powered the post-war boom.
Meiji Japan is another powerful example of a rapid state-driven transformation, right?
Absolutely. Facing the existential threat of Western colonial powers, Japan's Meiji leadership in 1868 embarked on a conscious and rapid modernization as a mission for national survival.
What do they do?
They dismantled feudalism, centralized political power, and then actively guided the economy. The government directly invested in building industries, creating infrastructure, and nurturing powerful corporate groups like the Zaibatsu through subsidies and tariffs. They implemented universal mass education focused on technical skills and national unity, and actively sought out and learned from foreign experts. This intense political will and coordinated national effort transformed Japan from an isolated feudal society into Asia's first industrialized power within a few decades.
And South Korea in the 1960s and 70s took a somewhat similar path, even without the catalyst of war.
Their mission was framed as a nonviolent war against poverty and underdevelopment.
Okay.
The state played a central, directing role through ambitious 5-year economic plans, close coordination with the large industrial conglomerates, the K-Ball, preferential credit allocation to export-oriented industries, massive infrastructure investment, and a focus on technical education. This highly coordinated, state-led model achieved incredibly rapid economic growth, lifting the nation out of poverty and transforming it into a major industrial and technological power.
The common thread in these historical examples seems to be political will, a clear vision or mission, and the state having the capacity to actively guide economic development and coordinate resources on a large scale.
Yes, absolutely. While war can be a potent catalyst, a compelling national vision or the shared understanding of a significant crisis can also generate the political momentum needed for this kind of proactive transformation.
Right.
It's about a collective decision to reshape society and the economy, rather than just letting market forces dictate outcomes.
Building the broad coalitions necessary for such profound change also seems critical, and history offers lessons there too. How do you get everyone on board?
Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal in the U.S. is a classic example of building and holding together a complex and often internally contradictory coalition.
Yeah, strange bedfellows sometimes.
Definitely. He navigated the interests of Southern conservatives, urban political machines, farmers, organized labor, and progressives. This required compromises, sometimes morally difficult ones, like initially excluding certain workers from protections to appease Southern politicians.
Right.
But he also responded strategically to popular pressure and the threat of more radical movements. The Second New Deal, which included foundational programs like Social Security and the Wagner Act empowering unions, was partly a response to rising popular agitation, which FDR leveraged to push through more transformative reforms, effectively undercutting more extreme challenges.
European integration after World War II also seems like a case of building a coalition among former adversaries. That must have been tough.
Indeed. The Marshall Plan provided an initial impetus, but the real political work involved leaders like Monnet, Schuman, and Adenauer persuading nations to pool sovereignty, starting with coal and steel production,
Okay.
to build the European coal and steel community, which evolved into the EEC and later the EU. They built consensus step by step, highlighting the long-term benefits of peace and shared prosperity through economic interdependence, gradually removing trade barriers and building trust over decades.
And even the neoliberal revolution of the 1980s, which reversed many post-war policies, required significant political will and coalition building, didn't it?
Absolutely. Led by figures like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, it represented a fundamental shift in economic thinking and policy. Lower taxes, deregulation, privatization, weakening the power of labor unions.
A huge shift.
Implementing this required immense resolve, clear and consistent messaging, direct confrontation with entrenched interest groups, and significant support from think tanks and economists who provided the intellectual framework. They also effectively utilized the economic crises of the 1970s, like stagflation, to argue for radical change and shift the Overton window of what was considered acceptable policy.
So the sources strongly imply that facing the immense disruption posed by AI and automation requires a similar level of political will, the articulation of a clear vision for a different future, and the ability to build a broad coalition willing to pursue proactive transformation.
That's a key message. Just as the post-war U.S. consciously built a coherent national economy, we may now need to consciously build a coherent digital economy and a new social contract for the age of AI. The scale of the challenge is vast, certainly. But history reminds us that challenges of this magnitude have been met before through collective action and deliberate choice. We have the advantage of historical hindsight and better analytical tools today.
Yeah.
The fundamental choice is whether we actively shape technology and globalization towards a future of shared prosperity and human well-being, or simply allow them to shape our societies by default, potentially leading to the dystopian outcomes many fear. Collective missions, history shows, can achieve what seems impossible in the status quo.
That historical perspective is incredibly grounding and also quite inspiring, actually. But building this kind of future isn't a guaranteed outcome. It's not easy. The sources also highlight significant challenges and important considerations that stand in the way.
Absolutely. There's no smooth automatic path from here to a, solar punk future of shared abundance. The road is fraught with practical, ethical, and political hurdles.
We touched on the immense challenge of funding programs like UBI at scale earlier. Let's look a little deeper at that funding issue.
Funding large-scale income support programs sufficient to make a real difference nationally is arguably the most significant practical barrier. As we mentioned, the cost in a country like the U.S. could run into the trillions annually.
Trillions. Still hard to grasp.
Potentially doubling current federal transfer spending. This necessitates finding entirely new, very substantial, and politically acceptable sources of revenue, or making radical reallocations of existing budgets.
And just getting political acceptance for that level of funding and potential taxation seems incredibly difficult. People don't like new taxes.
It is highly uncertain. Generating the political buy-in needed to implement significant wealth redistribution or high taxes on capital, AI, or resource extraction consistently over time faces powerful resistance from entrenched interests.
Yeah.
There are also genuine policy debates, as critics worry whether a flat UBI payment can effectively replace complex, targeted social services that address diverse and specific needs beyond just income.
So, the sources suggest that while UBI is crucial as a safety net, it's likely insufficient on its own without these broader structural changes we talked about.
That's the nuance, yeah. UBI provides a necessary floor, but without addressing the underlying trends of capital concentration or the structure of labor markets, the gains from UBI could simply be absorbed by rising costs.
By inflation eating it up.
Or it may fail to provide the broader economic security and agency that people derive from inclusive ownership or other forms of participation. Potential funding sources like high taxes on automation or carbon, public ownership stakes in productive assets, land value taxes, or resource rents are debated, and their political feasibility at the required scale is a major unknown.
So maybe phased implementation.
Phased implementation might be necessary to allow society to adjust psychologically and economically.
Okay. Another significant challenge lies within the very digital technologies we discussed, that inherent tension between transparency and privacy. How do you balance those?
This is a critical design challenge. While blockchain and distributed ledger technology offer transparency, which can enhance accountability and prevent corruption.
Which sounds good.
That same transparency, if linked to identifiable individuals, could enable unprecedented surveillance or discrimination.
Like with CBDCs, for example.
Yeah.
Central bank digital currencies.
Exactly. While CBDCs offer potential benefits like improved payment efficiency and financial inclusion, as perhaps seen with the Bahamas sand dollar, they also introduce the potential for state oversight and control. China's digital yuan, with its concept of controllable anonymity and traceability of larger transactions, explicitly allows authorities to monitor financial flows and implement targeted policies.
That worries people.
It raises significant concerns, particularly in Western security circles who worry about potential surveillance capabilities and the ability to bypass traditional financial systems and sanctions.
And SSI, self-sovereign identity, which is designed for individual privacy, faces its own set of challenges too.
SSI aims to put the individual in control of their data and identity, enhancing privacy, but practical challenges remain. Securely managing one's own cryptographic keys is technically difficult for many.
Yeah, definitely.
There are questions about digital literacy gaps, ensuring inclusivity for everyone, and how guardianship would work for those unable to manage their own keys.
Right.
While SSI reduces reliance on central authorities, trust still shifts to the network maintainers and the governance bodies operating the SSI system. Their legitimacy and accountability, as explored with models like Sovereign, are crucial to prevent new forms of control or censorship.
And WorldCoin seems to embody many of these privacy and trust concerns in a very visible, maybe extreme way.
WorldCoin is perhaps the most controversial example discussed. Despite the stated privacy goals and claims of deleting raw biometric images, privacy advocates remain highly concerned, describing it as a dystopian trade. Worries about the potential for exploitation, particularly of vulnerable populations drawn by the promise of free tokens, are significant. The transparency of data handling and the governance structure of the private foundation controlling the technology and token supply remain key points of contention.
So it highlights the risk of centralizing immense power over a potentially essential global identity system in private, less accountable hands compared to potentially democratic governments.
Exactly. It's a huge concentration of power potential.
And these new digital systems push against existing legal and governance structures, creating gaps and confusion.
They do. DAOs are a clear example, forcing the legal system to either create entirely new frameworks, like Wyoming's DAO laws, or attempt to apply existing regulations in novel ways, as seen with the CFTC's actions.
Right.
Similarly, SSI requires addressing legal recognition for digital credentials and actively working to bridge the digital literacy gap to prevent exclusion.
How do we ensure these new systems actually empower everyone and don't just shift concentrations of power to new gatekeepers, whether they are large token holders in DAOs, the developers of digital infrastructure, or private entities like WorldCoin? That seems like a core problem.
That is a fundamental design challenge running through all these discussions. Building inclusivity needs to be intentional. It can't be an afterthought.
So what does that mean, practically?
It requires designing governance structures that are genuinely democratic, transparent, and accountable, ensuring access and digital literacy for all segments of the population, and potentially regulating or designing these systems to prevent excessive concentrations of ownership or control in the hands of a few.
And with automated systems, especially those run by code, the risk of catastrophic failure or unintended consequences from bugs or malicious code is very real, isn't it? We've seen examples.
The 2016 DAO hack is a stark historical lesson here. Unstoppable code executing flawed logic can lead to massive losses for these systems to become reliable public infrastructure. Designing in circuit breakers or emergency multisigs, essentially fail-safes controlled by a trusted human committee or a broader community, is crucial. Protocols like MakerDAO and Agave have incorporated these mechanisms to provide a safety valve in emergencies.
So a blend of rule by algorithm and human oversight is necessary. You can't just let the code run wild.
Yes, the sources imply a form of cybernetic governance combining the efficiency and reliability of automated roles with necessary human oversight, judgment, and fail-safes for resilience and crisis management. Rigorous independent audits of smart contracts and system designs are also absolutely essential.
Finally, the sources offer a clear warning against relying solely on market forces to solve the problems created by automation. Don't just assume the market will fix it.
This is what one source calls the labor substitution fallacy. The warning is that if highly capable automation displaces workers, there is no inherent economic law guaranteeing that markets will automatically create enough new jobs,
Right.
particularly jobs that are of comparable quality or pay for those displaced workers.
Yeah, that's the worry.
If a society desires broad prosperity, meaningful employment, however redefined, or economic security for its population, it must make conscious policy choices. Simply relying on market forces, or even just providing UBI without other systemic reforms, might see any income gains absorbed by rising costs or fail to provide genuine economic agency.
So UBI is a vital tool as a floor, but it needs to be part of a broader framework.
Exactly, including wealth redistribution, labor market reform, investment in public goods, and fostering inclusive ownership models.
So intentional design, informed by historical lessons, and a clear-eyed view of the significant challenges are all absolutely necessary to navigate this transition.
It requires collective will, deliberate action, and a willingness to learn from the diverse experiments currently underway, both the successes and the failures.
Okay, let's bring this deep dive to a close. We've journeyed through this stack of sources, confronting the profound impact that automation is already having on traditional work and economic inequality.
Yeah, it's a sobering picture in some ways.
But we've also explored a wide range of diverse real-world experiments aimed at rethinking how wealth is distributed and how ownership is structured, from local land trusts and global worker co-ops to national wealth funds and capital endowments.
And we've examined how new digital technologies like blockchain, DAOs, and verifiable identity systems could potentially be used to create entirely new forms of economic participation and civic agency.
Right.
Albeit with significant challenges regarding privacy, governance, and power concentration that we can't ignore.
What emerges is a picture where these seemingly disparate efforts aren't isolated curiosities. They're tangible steps being taken right now, all pointing towards building a future where prosperity isn't solely tied to traditional wage labor, where human well-being encompassing purpose, connection, and meaning is prioritized, and where technology, if designed and governed thoughtfully, can become a tool for shared abundance rather than concentrated wealth and power.
The historical lessons reinforce this potential, reminding us that grand economic and social changes are possible through conscious choice, political will, building broad coalitions, and often rallying around a shared mission in the face of crisis or opportunity.
But, as we discussed, this more hopeful, maybe solar-punk-leaning future isn't automatic or inevitable. It absolutely requires intentional design of our systems and institutions.
Intentionality is everything.
It means actively learning from the successes and failures of these ongoing experiments, squarely addressing the significant challenges like funding, privacy, governance, and ensuring inclusivity so no one is left behind.
It's fundamentally about making a collective choice to shape technology, to serve humanity and build a more equitable world, rather than passively allowing technology and market forces to shape us and perhaps exacerbate existing inequalities.
So here's a provocative thought for you to carry forward as you go about your day. If history demonstrates that societies possess the capacity to actively choose and construct vastly different economic systems in response to technological change and crisis, what are the first concrete steps you believe our communities or nations should take today to intentionally begin building that more equitable, resilient, and human-centered future in this age of automation and AI? What possibilities or challenges stood out most to you from all the examples we explored?
Think about the vision, the building blocks, and the will it might take to make that happen in your own community or context.
That's all for this deep dive. We hope it's giving you plenty to consider.